Middle East politics are complicated, to say the least, and nowhere is this more evident than in Syria. The crisis-hit Arab countries experienced mayhem amid operations by the so-called U.S.-led coalition. An attack on a Syrian army position amid an ongoing fragile ceasefire has escalated a war of words and a bout of brinksmanship between Moscow and Washington. We have more in this following report.
Bloodshed under the pretext of stopping bloodshed. This is how some explain the U.S.-led coalition's engagement in the war-ravaged Syria. On Saturday, the Arab country went through another day of carnage, but this time by those who claim to be fighting terrorists. U.S. warplanes targeted a military airport near the eastern city of Deir Ezzor, killing scores of Syrian soldiers and injuring over 100 more.
This was a coordinated attack with 2 F-16 planes, 2 A-10 planes, a drone. It was also done in coordination with an Israeli drone attack that occurred on the Golan Heights.
The U.S. Defense Department has admitted to striking the Syrian military positions, but said it was unintentional. And the U.S. envoy to the United Nations has said Washington regrets the loss of life.
We are investigating the incident. If we determine that we did indeed strike Syrian military personnel, that was not our intention. And we, of course, regret the loss of life.
The strikes, which came less than a week into a fragile ceasefire in Syria, casts further doubts on the future of the truce deal. Russia's envoy to the UN has accused the United States of violating its commitments to a cessation of hostilities, as well as its pledge not to target Syrian government positions. Vitaly Churkin also rejected the U.S. military statement that said the raid was originally aimed at Daesh.
It is quite significant and frankly suspicious that the United States chose to conduct this particular airstrike at this time. Why would all of a sudden the United States choose to help the Syrian armed forces defending Deir Ezzor?
The U.S. attack helped Daesh terrorists take control of the area, although the Syrian army managed to retake the lost ground. The Syrian Foreign Ministry has written identical letters to the UN Secretary General and the Security Council, detailing the latest bloodshed and urging respect for Syria's sovereignty. The ministry said the attack proves the U.S. was helping the Daesh terrorist group. Earlier on Saturday, Russian President Vladimir Putin also questioned the U.S. commitment to the ceasefire and said Washington was not prepared to break with terrorist elements.
As the United States has demonstrated its hypocrisy, its deceitfulness, its duplicity, it has no intention of peace. It has no intention of truce. It has every intention of removing Assad, and it is going to do it through every deceitful, sneaky way it possibly can.
Syria remains at a critical juncture after more than 5 years of deadly mayhem unleashed by terrorist groups operating there, with active financial and logistic support from the West, especially the United States and some of its regional allies such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel and Qatar. The so-called U.S.-led coalition in Syria and Iraq has long been criticized for failing to curb the spread of terrorism. It seems that Washington and its allies have been seriously worried over the fate of those they have been nourishing for years. The latest attack on the Syrian army position makes such claims even stronger.
Joining us now is publisher and editor of Politics First, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, who's with us from the British capital, London. Mr. Papadopoulos, welcome to the program. We listened to the comments of the Russian ambassador to the UN, Vitaly Churkin. He chose the word suspicious for the U.S. attack on this Syrian army position. Tell us more, please.
Well, first of all, can I say how utterly shocked and utterly disgusted I am with the American massacre of Syrian troops in Deir Ezzor. And can I also express my condolences to the families of the Syrian soldiers who were killed in that American airstrike. Those Syrian soldiers, they were elite soldiers who had been recently deployed to that part of Syria to fight against ISIS. Their deaths, their cruel deaths, are not just a loss for Syria, they are a loss for the whole world, because the whole world is fighting against Islamist terrorism, or is engulfed by Islamist terrorism. Now, let's get down to disseminating what's happened. I'd like to approach it in two ways. First of all, if we can assume that what happened in Deir Ezzor was an accident, and I emphasize if, then what it shows is that that is what happens when the Americans do not coordinate their air actions in Syria with the Russians. Because if they had, this wouldn't have happened. Secondly, that is what happens when the Americans rely on terrorist groups in Syria for intelligence, because those terrorist groups in Syria the Americans are relying on will wholeheartedly give information on the coordinates, on the locations of the Syrian army in the hope that the Americans will bomb them. However, we can look at this in another way. Was that a deliberate strike on the Syrian army by the Americans? And I would say that is more than conceivable. That is very, very plausible. We know that the Americans have been complicit in the rise of ISIS in Syria. One such example is the fact that America's staunch allies in the region, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, have played a leading role in the emergence of ISIS in Syria. And if the Americans had been against their friends supporting ISIS, they would have said so, and the Turks and the Saudis and the Qataris would have backed off. And we can also have a look at the response of America's ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power. And let me just say about her, she really is an odious official, and the Americans certainly are not short in producing odious officials. She is one, Madeleine Albright is one, Hillary Clinton is one, Donald Trump is one. These people really are dreadful human beings, and they are such a menace to the world. But look at her response. She used the word regret. Now, I'm sorry, but regret is not the same as apologising. Look in the Oxford English Dictionary, okay? If she was genuine, if the Americans were genuine that this had been an accident, they would express remorse, they would apologise. But she also attacked Russia for raising this issue at the United Nations Security Council. Well, I'm sorry, but Russia had every right to raise it. The ceasefire, which has been very, very precarious, has been abided by and respected by the Syrian government and the Syrian army. However, numerous terrorist groups in Syria, which the Americans are backing, have not abided by it. And so Russia has every right now to say that what the Americans have done in Deir Ezzor could be the final nail in the coffin of this so-called ceasefire. So the fact that that Samantha Power has reacted to the Russian to the Russian action of referring it to the Security Council in such a hostile, in such an aggressive way, I would argue shows that what we could be looking at here is that the American strike in Deir Ezzor was not an accident, that it was deliberate. And as Vitaly Churkin, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, said, why, after all these years of the Syrian army being surrounded in Deir Ezzor, why did the American Air Force all of a sudden decide to fly into that region and attack ISIS? Why didn't they do it a year ago? Why didn't they do it 2 years ago? Why now? Well, it's no coincidence in the last few days, 1,000 elite Syrian soldiers were deployed to Deir Ezzor, and then all of a sudden, the Americans, a couple of days later, they carry out a murderous strike in Deir Ezzor, and they kill possibly up to 100 Syrian soldiers. Now, anything is possible in life, but to me, I would say that that looks like and sounds like more than just a coincidence.
Thank you very much. Publisher and editor of Politics, first joining us from London, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos.